Good morning. I want to first thank the organizers for inviting me out today. When Jay talked about jobs in weed, he didn't mention professors, but professors also benefit from weed being grown in Ohio. So I'm one of those guys who encourage weed production as much as possible in the state. The difference is my job security is often associated with your problems, which is probably not good for you guys, but it's good for me. But that gives me a reason to try to find solutions to some of these problems through my research. So we're not going to deal with anything about statistics and modeling today. What I'm going to do today is talk to you about weed quality and most importantly, emphasize disease problems and its association with weed quality. I think diseases are probably the single most important set of factors associated with weed quality problems in Ohio. So my emphasis as a plant pathologist is going to be on wheat diseases and its impact on grain yield and quality. So if we were to look at the very standard set of management guidelines, and I know you guys all know this, you guys all do this, I'm not going to tell you guys how to plant wheat. We typically recommend that you plant, select hybrids, select varieties. That's your first line of defense in terms of improving wheat quality and wheat yield. We want to select high-yielding varieties, and specifically with good resistance to diseases, because diseases are probably the single most important yield limiting and quality limiting factor in the state. So you want to select good disease resistance. And in the last 10 years, we've made great progress, myself and my colleague Clay Sneller, for example, in breeding for resistance to our main diseases in the state. We've got good powdery mildew resistant varieties, we've got good staganospora resistant varieties, and now we've got good scab resistant varieties. 11% of the varieties that we plant in our wheat performance trial each year has some level of resistance to scab. No variety is immune to scab, so if you plant wheat, you could potentially have a scab problem if the weather is highly variable. No variety is immune. But if you plant a resistant variety, then your success with a fungicide program for managing scab is much greater if you plant a resistant variety. 11% of the variety in the performance trial, published every year on the website, in the county journal, has some level of resistance to scab. So that's your first line of defense. You want to choose your best variety based on resistance. And if you have to choose between a powdery mildew resistant variety and a scab resistant variety, because no variety is resistant to every disease, I would say choose scab resistance first, because you can manage powdery mildew or the foliar diseases effectively with a fungicide or integrated management program. The next one would be plant after the Hessian fly-free date. This is a date that we definitely want to revisit over the next couple of years, because with changing weather conditions, I'm not sure how valid the September 22nd and October 5th planting dates are, because this was developed way back in the past before we've seen the changes we've seen in weather conditions. So this needs to be revisited, but it's a valid planting date still, because it allows us to escape conditions favorable for early season disease development. If you plant after the Hessian fly safe date, then you're looking at situations where aphid populations are lower, and you're likely to have less problem with barley yellow dwarf virus, for example. You also evade early infection with foliar diseases such as powdery mildew and staganospora. So that's one of the advantages of using the Hessian fly safe date. But over the next couple of years, we want to revisit these dates with some new research. We typically recommend seeding rate. This is important for plant population. Very standard seeding rate, 1.2 to 1.6 million seeds per acre. If you're planting late because of wet conditions, then you want to increase your seeding rate. The fourth one would be planting depth. Under Ohio's conditions with constant freeze and thaw during the winter months, heaving is a big concern. So you want to plant at 1.5 inches, your seeding depth. Very standard recommendation for Ohio's conditions. And then nitrogen application. You want to apply about 20 to 30 pounds in the fall to increase tiller development, and then you apply 70 to 90 pounds in the spring for a total of about 90 to 130 pounds of nitrogen. This is very standard recommendation. Like I said, I'm quite sure you guys know all of this stuff. You guys keep doing this stuff. Now, what we've seen over the last couple of years, in an effort to make wheat more competitive with corn and soybeans, lots of different programs have been tried. And one of the things I wanted to do is see how these different programs have affected disease development over the last few years. So we've got wide row wheat, we've got variable N rate wheat, and we've got early application or split application programs. These are all efforts, like I said, to try to make wheat more competitive. Wide row wheat would allow you to plant wheat in a relay intercropping with soybeans, so you can plant soybeans and wheat in the same field in the same year. Wide row wheat also affect your machine inventory. If you've got 30-inch rows wheat, then you don't need to have a separate drill to plant wheat when you plant corn and soybeans. Nitrogen rate, there's lots of quality traits associated with higher nitrogen rates, so we've had programs we've tried over the last couple of years looking at higher rates to increase overall quality. A nitrogen rate also increases yield. And then we've got different fungicide application programs, green up applications, split applications, all in an effort to increase wheat yield and quality. So my question is, and some of the research I've done over the last couple of years, is how do these things affect yield and quality, and how they affect yield and quality through their impact on diseases. So what I'm going to share with you today is some slides from some research I've done over the last several years. And I've got a lot of slides here. I've got 30-something different slides. I don't care to go through them all. So if during my presentation there's a question you're unclear about something, please feel free to ask. But I'm going to give you a snapshot of what I've done over the last several years to look at all these different aspects of wheat management in an effort to impact yield and quality. So myself and Dr. Lindsay, with some funding from the Ohio Small Grains Marketing Program, looked at row spacing and N rates' effect on yield, quality, and diseases. So what we did is set up a series of experiments across the state, and we planted wheat in 7.5-inch rows, 15-inch rows, and then within those row spacing, we apply nitrogen rates ranging from 30 pounds per acre to 160 pounds per acre. And then we went back into those fields, we quantified yield, we quantified test weight, looked at disease, and looked at the overall response, the association between disease and yield as influenced by nitrogen rate and row spacing. We look at some yield data, and the first thing we notice is with row spacing, you've got a reduction in yield in wide row wheat. 2013, 2014, 2015. This here is in kilograms per hectare, but I did some conversion to bushels per acre. So we've got a 2.4 bushel reduction in yield when you plant wheat in wide row in 2013. 2014, 2015, we saw 8 bushel reduction in yield in wide row wheat compared to the standard 7.5-inch row. And this makes sense because in this wide row wheat production system, you're planting less seed, less plant population per unit area. And if you don't choose the right variety, so this is the key point here, if you don't choose the right variety and you want to plant wide row wheat, you're going to lose some yield. There are specially adapted varieties for wide row wheat, and those are published on the Field Crops Disease website. If you want to plant wide row wheat so that you can practice relay intercropping, you want to choose the right variety, because if you don't, then you can lose some yield. With the right variety, there is still a little yield reduction, but it's never as high, at least in the data I've looked at, as 8 bushels reduction in yield. So the next thing we wanted to look at is how does wide row wheat affect scab? Fusarium head blight, head scab, is our main disease problem in the state. And we looked at some of the same data from 2013, 2014, 2015. And what we observed is in the wider rows, we've got slightly higher levels of scab in the wider rows than in the narrow rows. We saw it in 2013, we saw it in 2014, we saw it in 2015. Now it's only 1.2%, 1 to 2% increase in scab, but it's still an increase. And if you've got an increase in scab, then you've got an increase in vomitoxin as well. Typically the two go hand in hand. Now, why is this the case? We're not sure. But my assumption is with wider rows, then you've got more air movement between those rows. And if you've got more air movement, then more spores can be traveling and depositing on those wheat spikes. So the take-home message is here, if you're planting wider rows, then you want to choose the right variety so that you don't have a yield reduction, and you want to plan to manage scab, plant a resistant variety, and be prepared to apply a fungicide because you're likely to see slightly higher levels of scab in wide row wheat than in narrow row wheat. The next question was, how does N rate affect yield and disease development in a production system with wide row and higher N rates? So we looked at, in those same experiments, we looked at N rates in 2013, ranging from 13 pounds to 120 pounds of nitrogen. In 2014, 2015, we looked at 140 to 160 pounds of nitrogen. And as you increase nitrogen, as you would expect, yield increased. You had a 68 bushel yield at 30 pounds of nitrogen in 2013. That increased by 9 bushels to 77 with the higher levels of nitrogen in 2013. In 2014, we had a 12 bushel increase in yield between the low N rate and the high N rate. And then 2015, we had a 14 bushel increase in yield between the 40 pound rate and the 160 pound rate of nitrogen. So definitely, if you use higher rates of nitrogen, obviously you're going to have to factor in the cost. If you use higher rates of nitrogen, you can see anywhere, at least based on my data, between a 9 and a 14 bushel increase in yield. Now, as a pathologist, obviously, I wanted to see how that impacted diseases. And here's my data for leaf rust. In all 3 years, we had fairly high levels of leaf rust. 2013, the levels were highest. And in all cases, what we observed was as you increase nitrogen rate, you also increase leaf rust severity. So the plots with the highest levels of nitrogen had the highest levels of leaf rust. In 2014, between the low and the high rates of nitrogen, you had a 12% increase in leaf rust severity. 2015, between the low and the high rates of nitrogen, you had a 24% increase in leaf rust severity. Why is that the case? Now, leaf rust is caused by a fungus that we called a biotroph, meaning that it needs to have healthy plant tissue to infect and cause disease. The more nitrogen you apply, the longer those leaf tissues stay healthy, the greener and more succulent those leaf tissue become. And if you've got healthy leaf tissue and you've got a biotrophic pathogen like leaf rust, then you could potentially have more leaf rust severity. We didn't see the same response for Staganospora. We didn't see that response for Septoria. We didn't see that response for powdery mildew. But for leaf rust, as you increase nitrogen, you've got more leaf rust. The good thing about this disease, it doesn't show up every year. It doesn't overwinter under our highest conditions. Spores have to be blown in from the south, so you can manage this disease. But if you know that you're going to use higher nitrogen programs, then you want to plan to manage leaf rust. A single fungicide application at flag leaf emergence, at boot stage, or even at anthesis would control this disease. But just that you know, if you're planning to use higher rates of nitrogen, then you want to plan to manage leaf rust. So here's some graph of that same data, and this is to show you the example of when you manage with fungicide, it does have an effect on leaf rust severity. So here we've got nitrogen rates increasing from 40 pounds to 160 pounds. And as nitrogen rate increases, leaf rust severity increases if you do not apply a fungicide. This is the solid line represents the check. Leaf rust severity increasing as N rate increased if you did not apply a fungicide. If you apply a fungicide at flag leaf, at boot stage, or at flowering, this is where the leaf rust severity stays. It stays low throughout. So that's the point I'm making. If you're using higher N rates and you don't apply a fungicide, leaf rust severity increases in a linear fashion. But if you apply a fungicide, leaf rust severity stays low across all N rates. And the impact of that is on yield. Here we've got some yield data. Yield increases as nitrogen rates increases, but the rate of increase in yield is much lower with the solid line if you don't manage leaf rust when compared to the broken lines if you manage leaf rust. So you've got about a 0.8 bushel increase for every 10 pounds of nitrogen when you don't manage leaf rust. This is the check. But if you manage leaf rust, you've got a 1.2 to 1.5 bushel increase for every 10 pounds of nitrogen if you manage the disease. So if you're using higher nitrogen rates, you definitely want to use a fungicide to hold back leaf rust, and you see the best return in terms of yield response to nitrogen increase if you use a fungicide. So you definitely want to plan to use a fungicide program if you're going to use higher nitrogen rates. Right, so that's a good question, Ed, and Laura and I are repeating these experiments, and you know you've been involved with this as well. We use nitrogen ranging from 40 to 160. Obviously, in my models, it doesn't plateau because we're still within low ranges of nitrogen. But even at these ranges that we're working with here, you're still seeing a response to diseases and a response in terms of yield. But you're right, we haven't hit. And we're going to look at higher levels as well, but this is what we worked with in these experiments.
But I mean, my question is, basically, we're going for optimal yields, we're going to be using nitrogen. Then for us, we probably ought to use the fungicide.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. So if the important thing to know exactly, so my question has always been, as we change our production system, and that's why I'm always piggybacking on Laura's grants, if we're going to change our production system, then we need to be prepared to manage diseases because it's going to change within the production system. That's basically what I'm saying. Okay? Questions? So green up fungicide application, this is a trend that has increased over the last couple of years. And it makes sense again. We want to try to improve productivity, increase grain quality with wheat production. We know we've got disease problems. We know we've got septoria and powdery mildew and Staganospora that can get established early. And if these diseases get established early, then it's going to impact yield and quality. So we've done a lot of research to try to look at if we do green up applications of fungicide, as opposed to the standard Fix 8 or Fix 10 application, how will that impact diseases and yield and quality? So we conducted a series of experiments across 4 states in 4 years to look at how green up applications impact Staganospora, septoria, and wheat yield and quality. So here is Staganospora, typical lens-shaped lesions on the leaf, develops towards the latter half of the growing season. Septoria, which is very close in terms of its behavior to this particular disease, but this one typically develops early in the season. Like I said, we've got lots of good varieties with good levels of resistance to these two, but if we don't control them, then these can reduce test weights. There's no vomitoxin associated with these two, but they impact yield by reducing test weight, causing shriveled and lightweight kernels, just like head scab. The difference is no vomitoxin. So we want to control these diseases. Now, this is a disease cycle and survives in crop residue, so hence, try not to plant wheat after wheat or rotate wheat with soybeans so you can reduce the amount of inoculum in crop residue. They spread in the spring. You probably would have seen quite a bit of Staganospora and septoria this year because if it rains, that's when you see most of these diseases. When spores are splashed from the residue to lower leaves on the wet conditions, that's when you typically see these diseases. And then they infect the leaves and cause reduction in the photosynthetic area, reducing grain yield and quality. Very classic disease cycle. Now we've seen some trends. Typically we recommend a single application Fix 8 and Fix 10. And we typically base our application on disease threshold. I still tell folks, walk fields. If you see disease, make a fungicide application decision. And we generally don't need a fungicide if we've got one of our best resistant varieties planted. Over the last several years, though, we've seen a shift in trend. People applying fungicide before Fix 8, the so-called green up application. We apply fungicide at split half rates, and we use plant health approaches to disease management. Now, there's lots of benefits and lots of reasons for some of these new approaches. For example, if you're taking a pass over the field to apply nitrogen, then you want to take advantage of the single pass and you apply a fungicide at the same time. That's the main reason why some of these early applications are being made. I don't have to make multiple passes over the field. If I make a pass over the field at Fix 8, I can have an 8% reduction in yield because the wheel tracks across the field. So I want to apply my fungicide early so I don't have to deal with reducing yield because the wheel tracks across the field. So it makes perfect sense. But we wanted to know how this impacts disease development. So we look at the effect of green up and split applications, and we wanted to compare Headline with Prosaro. 2 different fungicides, 2 modes of actions, and we know from research that Headline, or strobies in general, have an effect on crop physiology. They extend the green leaf area of the plant. They affect water exchange. They affect stomatal opening. This has been proven. We know that they affect crop physiology. So the argument always is, because of these effects on crop physiology, are they any better than Prosaro in terms of disease and yield response? So that's why we want to compare these two, and we want to compare them in green-up application program and split application programs. So here's a series of treatment that we looked at. Headline at standard rate, Prosaro at standard rate, and we did a full rate application at green-up, full rate application of Fix 8 to Fix 9, full rate application at Fix 10, and then we did split half rate application, and we want to compare them across 4 years, 4 locations. In other words, 8 location years of data. And here's a summary. So we asked the question, what is the risk of damage to the flag leaf? The green bars conveniently shows you green-up application. The hash bars shows you Prosaro. The plain bars shows you headline. So you've got 4 bars for headline, 4 bars for Prosaro. The green shows you green-up application. The risk of damage to the flag leaf is greatest with the green-up application for both fungicides. So you don't see a benefit in terms of disease control with the green-up application. Your greatest benefit in terms of disease control, lower damage to the flag leaf, is with the Fix 10, Fix 8, and even the split a half rate application give you the best results in terms of reduction. The results between Prosaro and Prosaro and headline is fairly comparable in terms of its effect on protecting the flag leaf. So this data here, 10 years, 8 location years of data, shows that the green-up application under the highest conditions is not beneficial in terms of protecting the flag leaf. In terms of yield response, conveniently, the green-up application, again, had the lowest yield response, and the highest yield response were seen with the Fix 10 application. Fix 8 and the split half-rate application also give you reasonable results in terms of yield response. So if you were to conclude in terms of a fungicide program based on application timing, whether you use Prosaro or you use headline, you don't see the benefit from the green-up application, not under the highest conditions. But we do see a benefit from applying Fix 8, Fix 10, and even the split half-rate application. Now the concern with the split half-rate application is fungicide resistance, because you're using half of the rate at early application and half of the rate later in the season. You could potentially run into problems with fungicide resistance because you're using a product at half the rate that it's recommended. We haven't done the research yet to look at that, but there's a lot of information out there with fungicide resistance, particularly to the strobies. So that's one of the reasons why I would suggest not using the split half-rate application. Okay? So it's a little bit of a fancy graph. I didn't want to include it, but I'm going to share with you anyway. So if you're looking at what is the economics of the programs that you use, we've got all the different fungicide programs here. Prosaro at Fix 5, green-up, Prosaro at Fix 8, Prosaro at Fix 10, split half rate, and then you've got the same programs for headline. And you ask the question, if I need a 4 or 5 or 6 bushel increase in yield, what is the probability, or what is the chance of me seeing those yield responses with these different fungicide programs? That's basically what this fancy, complicated graph is showing you. And if you need a 2 bushel increase in yield, the fungicide to pay for itself, then you've got a 60 to 80% chance of seeing that with Fix 8 and Fix 10 application. That's basically what I'm saying. With the Fix 5 application, both headline and Prosaro, you only got about a 30% chance of seeing a 2 bushel increase in yield if that's what you need to offset fungicide application costs at a higher grain price. 50% chance of seeing a 3 to 4 bushel increase in yield with the Fix 10 and Fix 8 application, and 50% chance of seeing a 1% increase in yield, a 1 bushel increase in yield with the green-up application. So basically what this is saying, in terms of economics, in terms of you seeing a benefit on your investment with these fungicide programs, your chance of seeing such a benefit is much higher with the Fix 8 and Fix 10 applications when compared to the Fix 5 applications. And one of the arguments used, like I said before, for using a Fix 8 a fixed 5 application is wheel tracked. So what we did, we adjusted these graphs. And if you look carefully, you can see the lines bouncing back and forth. We adjusted these graphs, reducing yield by 3% for fixed 10 and fixed 8 applications. Because if you drive across the field to apply a fungicide at fixed 8 and fixed 10, then you can see about a 3% reduction in yield. So we did use this graph to adjust those yields to see exactly if there is benefit from the fixed 5 application when compared to the fixed 10 and fixed 8 application, the same results. So even though there's some reduction in yield with the fixed 8 and the fixed 10 application, it's still not sufficient to justify doing the fixed 5 application instead of the fixed 10 application. Okay? Questions on application timing, split rates, half rates? All right, so I'm going to spend the last half of this presentation talking about the disease. That's my favorite disease. Sorry, it's a disease. I know you guys don't like diseases, but I'm a plant pathologist. So head scab. This is our single most important yield limiting factor in the state of Ohio. Weather conditions can be a problem, insects can be a problem, but at the end of the day, head scab is our biggest problem in terms of yield and quality. And I've done a lot of research over the last few years looking for strategies to minimize the impact of head scab. So I'm going to share with you a snapshot of all the things we have done, and hopefully I don't overwhelm you with all the slides, but if you got questions, again, stop me and ask me during my presentation. So it impacts yield. So this is a healthy wheat field, scabby wheat field, heads completely bleached, discolored, high levels of amatoxin, contamination of grain, low test weight, low grain quality, food and animal health problems. You guys know all of this stuff already. So disease cycle survives in crop residue. Both corn and wheat residue serves as a source of inoculums. If you plant wheat after corn, you're going to have head scab if the weather conditions are favorable. If you plant wheat after wheat, you're going to have head scab if the weather conditions are favorable. In the spring, spores are produced, disseminated to the wheat heads, infect, damage the rachis, block the movement of water and nutrients, causes bleach discoloration. Very classic disease cycle for this disease. I'm quite sure you guys know this as well. The problem with head scab is management decision. And I put a timeline here to show you guys the challenge of managing this disease. If you put a fungicide on the head scab fungus in a plate in the lab, it kills everything. You got 100% death of the fungus most times in a plate in the lab. The problem with managing this in the field is getting the timing correct and getting the fungicide on the target, which is the weed spike. That's the biggest problem in the field. So most of what we've done over the last couple of years is try to improve the efficacy, the efficiency with which you can use a fungicide to get the best control of head scab as possible. So heading, and this is when you got to make your fungicide application. You've got a grace period about 5 to 10 days based on my research. I'll show you in a little bit. But you want to make your application here, when those anthers are sticking out, when they're fresh. Now, how often do you go to your field and you know for sure that these anthers are fresh? So we've got a little grace period of about 5, 6 days when we can make that fungicide application decision. But your best results are still seen when you apply the fungicide at anthesis. Now, this fungicide is applied well before you see disease. For foliar diseases, you can walk fields, scout fields, look for disease, use disease threshold, and make your fungicide application decisions. For head scab, if you see head scab, it's too late to apply a fungicide. So you're basically making a fungicide decision blindly without seeing head scab. And that's why we try to get up with all these different tools to help improve your decision-making power in terms of managing this disease. So here's the timeline, pre-harvest interval. So you've got about a 30 to 35 day pre-harvest interval, depending on the fungicide. So 1, you have to make your application at flowering before you see scab. 2, you want to make your application before the pre-harvest interval to legally use the fungicides. So those are 2 limitations. And then you see scab about 18 to 21 days after flowering. So you're making application decisions before you know how much scab you've got. So to help with this process, we've developed this forecasting system. Not perfect, but it's 80% accurate, so it's better than your best guess. And we encourage people to use the forecasting system because it's a useful tool to help guide fungicide application decisions. Here's a map of Ohio showing you green, yellow, and red. Green means low risk of scab, yellow means moderate risk of scab, and red means high risk of scab. And you can come up with these risk prediction by first, these are my commentary, so I help during the scab season. If you sign up for email alerts during the scab season, once I update this site with these commentaries, you should receive a text message or an email telling you that something is up in the world of scab. See what Pierce has to say. You choose your state, Ohio. You choose your wheat class. We raise winter wheat here. You choose susceptibility of your variety. Susceptible, very susceptible, moderately resistant. You choose the weather conditions you can use to do forecasting. You choose the flowering date. These are the key steps in using this tool. Choose your state, choose the wheat class, choose the variety reaction, choose the flowering date, and then once you do that, it gives you an estimate of the risk of scab. Red means there's a high risk of scab exceeding 10% severity. Higher than 10% severity, you got more than 10% vomitoxin level. Yellow means there's a moderate risk of scab exceeding 10% severity, and green means there's a low risk of scab exceeding 10% severity. Given that you have to make a fungicide application decision well before you see head scab, this is your best tool in terms of helping you, taking some of the guessing of the scab management. The question always pops up is, okay, I did all of this, like I did in 2015, and then it rains. What can I say? This is meant to predict scab, and if it rains as badly as it did in 2015, then nothing is going to save you, sorry. So we're doing some research looking at some of those post-scab development conditions and how they affect scab. And our idea is, so these models are meant to make management decisions. So we use information from the 2 weeks before flowering, and that information is used in this model to predict the risk of scab. Now what we want to do in our next set of models is use this information along with information between flowering and harvest to predict vomitoxin levels. Because vomitoxin levels are driven not only by pre-flowering conditions, but by conditions between flowering and harvest. So that's the next step. Use those conditions to predict vomitoxin levels. Now a vomitoxin prediction model is not going to help you in terms of making a fungicide application decision, but it's probably going to help you in terms of making grain marketing decisions. So that's the next set of steps we're going to look at to develop models. But this is a useful tool given that you have to make a fungicide decision well before you see head scab. So the best fungicides for head scab management would be Proline, Prosaro, and Caramba. We've tested these over several years, and on average, you got about a 40 to 42% reduction in scab with Proline, Prosaro, and Caramba, compared to about a 35 to 40% with Tilt and Folicure. And for vomitoxin, you've got about a 40 to 45% reduction. This is on average. So these numbers can go up and down, but on average, that's what you see with these 3 fungicides. So the next step we're doing now, a series of experiments we're looking at, is to see, okay, now that Folicure and tebuconazole is off patent in general, if I apply Prosaro at anthesis, these fungicides being off patent, they're about $1, $2 an acre. Can I go back in with a cheap fungicide and do a second application before the pre-harvest interval, and how that's going to improve scab control? So we're running those experiments right now to see, okay, standard application is 1 application at flowering. That's our standard recommendation. But now that we've got fairly inexpensive fungicides, both of these are inexpensive, they're less effective, but they're inexpensive. If I go back in and do a second application with one of these inexpensive fungicides, am I going to see a substantial reduction in scab and vomitoxin? So we're running those experiments right now. But our best fungicide programs would be Prosaro, Proline, Caramba at anthesis. They give you the best reduction in scab and vomitoxin. the strobies. I like having the strobies as active ingredients that you can use in combination with the triazoles because it's a good resistant management strategy. If you're looking at head scab, this is from 300 data points collected across the US. This is not only Ohio's data. This is 300 data points collected across the entire US over the last 20 years through the scab initiative. And if you apply a strobie, we see consistent increase or higher levels of vomitoxin. I wouldn't say increase, because I don't think the strobies increase vomitoxin, but we see higher levels of vomitoxin when compared to the check when you use a strobie. So if head scab is a problem, wet conditions, I would say try not to use a strobie. If you use a strobie, headline, for example, at week 9, 6% increase in vomitoxin. Use headline at week 10, boot stage, 16% increase, 15% increase in vomitoxin. If you use headline at heading, 18% increase in vomitoxin. If you use Quadris, which is a sister chemistry, 16% increase in vomitoxin. Another strobie, fluoxetine, can't remember this one. Strobie, 13% increase in vomitoxin. Fluoxystrobin, Evido. Okay? So this is fairly consistent. And I'm not trying to poke at anybody selling fungicides, but this is what we see consistently with all three of these chemistries over 20 years of research. So I typically recommend, and my fungicide efficacy chart typically says, do not use the strobies if you've got scab risk, if you've got high potential for scab. Excellent fungicides for foliar disease, excellent fungicide for rust, for head scab. Try to stay away from the strobies. Questions? So the best management program for scab, combine your best fungicides with your best resistant variety. If you combine the best fungicide, Prosaro or Caramba, with the best resistant variety, you see about 70 to 75% reduction in disease and about 70% reduction in vomitoxin levels. Combine the best fungicide with the best resistant variety. This is when you compare to the susceptible untreated check. If you use Prosaro with a moderately susceptible variety, then you see about 70% reduction in disease, about 60% reduction in toxin levels, and that efficacy goes down if you use Prosaro alone, if you use resistance alone, and if you use moderately susceptible reaction alone. So your best bet with foliar diseases, we say if you use resistant variety, you don't need a fungicides. That's the recommendation for foliar diseases. With head scab, it's different. If you've got head scab concerns, plant the best resistant variety and the best fungicide that give you the best response in terms of head scab reduction. Now the big problem, I typically recommend head scab control when the wheat is at flowering. If you're going to have head scab problems and the wheat is at flowering, then it's probably raining. And the problem is, how am I going to apply a fungicide if it's raining? So one of the questions we've addressed over the last couple of years, how rain fast is Prosaro, Caramba, Folicure for head scab control? So here's some data showing some rain fast results. And we conducted 3 experiments. 2012, we didn't have a whole lot of disease. That year was hot and dry, our drought year. But in 2013, we had 2 experiments, and we had some scab to look at how rain fast this particular fungicide is. And this was Prosaro. We're doing some research with Caramba right now, but this is Prosaro results. So to check, no fungicide was applied. And then 0 minutes, meaning that rain was applied shortly after the fungicide was applied at 0 minutes. Rain was applied 60 minutes after the fungicide. Rain was applied 105, 150, 195 minutes after the fungicide. If you look at this data, I'm not going to show you the stats, but relative to the check, even this one gives you some scab and vomitoxin reduction. Okay, so it looks like it's fairly rain fast. Even you apply the rain immediately after the fungicide was applied, you still see about 50% reduction relative to the untreated check. With vomitoxin, the results weren't as expressive, but you still see a reduction in vomitoxin relative to the check, even when you apply the rain immediately after the fungicide application, or 60 minutes after the fungicide application. So we wanted to do this experiment in more controlled conditions because we did this in the field, and obviously with the fields there's lots of interference. We did this early in the morning when there's dew on the plant. So we wanted to do the same experiment on the controlled conditions to see what happened. So we had the same set of treatments. We used 2 different inoculation methods, and here's our check. No fungicides. And this time we included a fungicide-treated check. In other words, check 1 was fungicide application with no rain. Check 2 was no fungicide, and check 1 was fungicide application with no rain, and all of these were inoculated. And if you look at the results from the rain-fast results, rain applied immediately after the fungicide was applied was no different from the treatment in which fungicide was applied without rain. And that was fairly consistent across all of these inoculation methods, these 4 combinations of inoculation methods and experiments. So I would say that Prosaro is fairly rain-fast. Within 15 minutes at least, within 15 minutes after you apply the fungicide, it's fairly rain-fast if conditions are dry enough for it to be absorbed. Close-up look at the same graph. Fungicide application, no rain, no fungicide. And here you've got fungicide rain imposed at different times after fungicide application. So I would say about here is where I would say we are rain-fast, about 15 to 30 minutes after the fungicide application. Questions? So one of the questions we always hear as well is how long does the fungicide stay effective on the plant surface? What's the residual life of the fungicide? And we did some research again to look at that. And we look at fungicide residue reduction over time on the plant surface. So in those same rain-fast experiments, we harvest wheat heads, and we quantified fungicide residue on those wheat heads over time. So we collected wheat heads 4 days after application, 8 days, 12 days, 16 days, and 20 days after application, and we quantified fungicide residue. And we saw residue half-life is about 6 days in one experiment, and about 9 days in the other experiment. So residue level on wheat spikes was reduced by half after about 7 days on average in those 2 experiments. So this is, again, useful information. It's rain-fast, but the residue on the wheat heads can be reduced by about, in 7 days, reduced by about 50% in about 7 days. How effective is this at controlling scab? We don't know. The follow-up experiments is to see exactly what does this reduction mean in terms of effective scab control. And
that residue is at the surface of the head or the entire head?
so we ground it. So we would have gotten stuff on the surface and in the grain in the head as well. I'm quite sure you guys got all of this data somewhere stashed away, but I got to answer these questions as an extension pathologist. All right, so the next set of things we asked, okay, if I can't apply my fungicide at flowering, then if I go in 2 days, 4 days, 6 days late, how effective is the fungicide going to be controlling head scab? Again, these are all practical questions. If a guy can get in there to apply a fungicide, the custom applicator is not available, the field is too wet, too soggy. If he goes in 2 days, 4 days late, is he going to see effective scab control with fungicides applied 3 days, 4 days late? So here we've got Caramba applied early. We've got about 20% control of vomitoxin. So this early means at heading, when the heads is fully emerged. And you got about 35% control of scab. When you applied it at the recommended flowering time, you got about a 40% of vomitoxin and about 55% control of scab. If you can't get in early, you want to apply for Caramba late, between 4 and 6 days late, you got fairly comparable control of scab. So you can go and actually go in and apply Caramba 4 days to 6 days late and still see scab and vomitoxin reduction comparable to what you would see with the recommended flowering time application. Prosaro, the same thing. If you apply Prosaro early, you don't see as good results when you apply it at full head emergence, but when you apply it late at flowering, or you apply it at 4 to 6 days late, you see better results than you would see with early applications. So if you got to hedge your bets, rain is coming, scab is potentially going to be a problem. Should I go in early at heading, or should I wait and go in 4 to 6 days late? Our results suggest that if you go in 6 days, 4 to 6 days late, you can see comparable levels of scab control. So here are more options for you to manage scab. It's not an easy disease to manage. If you can't get your fungicide application at flowering, if you're going 4 to 6 days late, you can still see good control. And the last bit of information is, okay, I've done all that I can do. I plant my resistant variety. I use the fungicide. Weather conditions at harvest is still terrible. I got problems with grain quality. Can I do something at the time of harvest to reduce scab? And this is obviously a plot combine. It's nowhere comparable to a commercial combine, but I think on a proportional scale, some of the response should hold up if you use a commercial combine. So we looked at changing combine configurations. Fan speed, shutter opening. The fan speed regulates the speed of the air going through the combine. The shutter opening controls the volume of the air going through the combine. And we look at those in inoculated plots, and we ask the question, how does changing combine configuration affect vomitoxin levels, affect fusarium damaged kernels, and affect test weight? And we did this over a period of 2 years, and C1 is the default configuration. We did not increase the fan speed. We did not increase the shutter opening. In other words, we do our standard calibration to harvest grain of a certain quality, of a certain grain size, and we did not change that configuration. Standard fan speed, standard shutter opening, and we had the highest levels of scab, highest level of FDK, and lowest test weight with the default configuration. But as we increase the fan speed and the shutter opening, we had the lowest level of FDK, significantly lower level of FDK, lower levels of scab numerically, and higher test weight. So these results suggest that, okay, if you really do still have a problem after you use a fungicide, you use a resistant variety, here is one last shot. Increase your fan speed, increase the shutter opening, increase the airflow through the combine, increase the volume of air going through the combine. It can reduce test weight, and it can increase test weight, and it can reduce FDK and vomitoxin levels. So here are some of the same results in a graph. We look at it at different levels of scab. So if you look at it when you've got about 7% scab, about 13% scab, 29% scab, 30% scab, and 34% scab, the trend holds up. With the default setting, without changing the combine configuration, without increasing the fan speed, you've got the highest levels of FDK. But as you change the fan speed, increase the fan speed, and increase the volume of air going through the combine, you see a reduction in FDK. If you look at vomitoxin, very similar trend. You see the highest level of vomitoxin, particularly at higher levels of disease with the default configuration. But as you increase fan speed and you increase the air going through the combine, it can reduce vomitoxin levels because you're blowing out some of those scabby kernels. Okay? So in terms of test weight, the opposite. The default configuration, lowest test weight. The test weight increase once you increase the fan speed and you increase the airflow over the combine. The two last combine configurations with wider shutter opening and higher airspeed that blows out the scabby kernels give you the highest test weight. So you can do something about increasing grain quality even after the fact. At the time of harvest, you can change your combine configuration. So I know it's a lot of information, but you got my phone number. If you got any questions, call me. But here's a summary of some of the things we've seen over the last couple of years. If you're planting wide row wheat and you're using higher N rates, then you want to come up with a disease management program. You can see more powdery milk. You can see more leaf rust with higher N rates. You can see more scab with wider row. So you want to definitely use a disease management program if you're going to change the cropping practices. Green up application is less effective than Fix 8 and Fix 10 application. So even though there's reasons to want to use half rates or split applications during green up, we haven't seen the same results under our highest conditions. So Fix 8 and Fix 10 would still be my recommended time for fungicide application for foliar disease control. Fungicide for scab is fairly rain fast, 30 to 60 minutes. If conditions are dry enough for that fungicide to be observed, then 30 to 60 minutes is fairly rain fast on the field conditions. And if you can't get in the field to apply a fungicide to control scab at flowering time, then 6 6 to 8 days after flowering will still give you good scab control. So don't not apply a fungicide. If you can get back in 6 days late, you're still going to see good scab control. And then increasing the combine fan speed and the airflow through the combine can contribute to increasing overall grain quality if you're harvesting scabby wheat fields. And obviously, these are the guys who did all the work. I just sat in my office telling them what to do. And funding from the U.S. Wheat and Barley Scab Initiative and some invaluable support from the Small Grains Marketing Program over the last couple of years. Like I said, I know it's a mouthful, but I get all excited when it comes to talking about wheat and scab. If you got any questions, please. Thank you.